But now moving back to our paper speakers and to Coco Huggins. Coco is a second-year PhD student in geography at Pembroke College. Her research evaluates UK welfare reform and policy responses to the 2008 financial crisis. She's an Associate Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and is about to commence a research post at the Department for Work and Pensions. She won the right to speak through open audition. Coco, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you, Madam President, for that introduction. I wanted to start by saying I am, in fact, a child of New Labour. I was born in 1997, just a few months after Tony Blair's Labour landslide. The first 13 years of my life, arguably my most formative years, were spent under New Labour. And it was a good time, but it wasn't perfect. And that is something I want to make very clear at the outset of this debate. In arguing that New Labour saved Britain, I am most certainly not arguing that New Labour was perfect. Mistakes were made, particularly, as people have already brought up, in foreign policy. The decisions to invade Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 should, I believe, leave a stain on our national conscience, regardless of what good intentions we may have had, or not had, when undertaking such intervention. But as we know, Britain has a very established track record of walking into other people's countries uninvited. And we can't really blame New Labour solely for that decision. It's part of a much deeper and long-standing problem of neo-imperialism and paternalistic thinking. Any interventionist decisions cannot therefore be blamed entirely on the New Labour administration. We must look at these things in their context. But returning to the motion, this House believes New Labour saved Britain. The most obvious question we need to ask ourselves is saved Britain from what? And in my speech, I'm going to focus on something which is often branded New Labour's greatest failure, the 2008 financial crisis, and demonstrate to you that far from being the cause of the financial crisis, the New Labour government actually saved Britain from the worst effects of the crisis. I will argue that the prolonged period of recession which has crippled Britain for the past decades is a result of Conservative Party policies of austerity and is not a hangover from Labour's allegedly profligate spending. I argue that without New Labour's unprecedented rescue package, the British banking system would have experienced an all-out collapse, leading to widespread panic. I'm probably going to address your point later, so I'll leave it. Leading to widespread panic and social unrest. Without the record levels of investment made in education and healthcare under New Labour, we would all have been in a much more deeper crisis now and in 2008 than we would have been otherwise. In order to demonstrate my point, I need to tackle one of the most deep-set myths in contemporary politics, that it was government overspending that caused the financial crisis. This is fundamentally untrue. The UK did not have significant national debt before the financial crisis. General government debt in the UK was only 42% of GDP in 2007. To put this into context, in France it was 64%, in the United States it was 65%, Portugal 68%. It was lower than almost any other country in Europe, apart from Spain and Ireland. It was lower even than Germany. The strong and stable stay of the Eurozone, and not by a small margin either, by 20 percentage points. Even in 2010, at the height of the financial crisis, even after the Treasury had spent £137 billion bailing out the British banking sector, the UK still had a lower debt as a percentage of GDP than all of those same countries, including Germany, which is generally considered to have fared the best out of the financial crisis of the major European economies. When did this change? After the Conservative coalition government came into power and instigated austerity policies. So let me take you back to 2008. The likes of Girls Aloud and the Sugar Babes were in the UK top 10 charts. About only 15% of Brits owned a smartphone, and a Freddo Frog would cost you 15 pence. These were very, very different times. But Britain was also teetering on the edge of all-out financial collapse, so perhaps not too dissimilar. The US, and indeed the UK mortgage markets, had been booming. But most of this growth was in so-called subprime mortgages. Lenders were routinely giving out mortgages over 100% of the property's value, counting on increasing property prices to recoup the cost. Lower-rated mortgage-backed securities were being repackaged with other assets as collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, to make them appear lower risk, and were offering much better returns than government bonds. But as soon as the housing bubble began to burst and property prices peaked, it became increasingly difficult to service those loans, and there were mass foreclosures across the United States. In September 2008, two of the US's biggest mortgage financing agencies, colloquially known as Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, had to be bailed out. The high prevalence of these mortgage-backed securities in the financial markets caused a ripple effect across the US. Lehman Brothers, which had previously been perceived as a rock of the US financial system, collapsed just days later, along with Merrill Lynch and AIG, a major insurance company. People stopped lending. And our economy is so built on credit that this sparked a major liquidity crisis, which, because of the increasingly integrated financial markets, caused a ripple effect, also in the UK. Now, RBS, then the world's biggest bank as measured by the size of its assets, was now hemorrhaging cash. Its share price fell over a third in just 24 hours, and then they stopped trading completely. On the eve of the crisis, the bank balance had a sheet that was larger than the whole UK economy, over £2 trillion worth of assets on its books. This same bank was now on the brink of complete and utter collapse and was threatening to bring down the rest of the UK economy. The UK's biggest bank was within 3 hours of running out of cash completely, of branches having to shut, cash machines closing, of people being unable to withdraw their money. And this wasn't just very wealthy people's money at risk. The world's billionaires, as we all know, usually have their cash stashed away in the lowly realms of, offshore and all that kind of thing. But we're talking about everyone's money. It was people like you whose student loan would have evaporated, teachers and ordinary workers' pay, your grandmother's pension. These could have been gone. Britain was within 3 hours, 180 minutes, from the run on its biggest bank. And this is where we come back to New Labour. Had the New Labour government not stepped in with a rescue package, we would have seen complete and utter panic. Sure?
Do you not feel that it was the failure of the New Labour government within their 11 years of power beforehand to reintroduce regulation of the financial sector that caused this systemic risk of financial sector?
I am actually going to address that in a short while, so I will leave that point. So had the New Labour government not stepped in with a rescue package, we would have seen complete and utter panic, as I said. And there was a real risk of widespread social disorder, rioting, looting, people fighting to get money out of their cash points, sorry. Imagine the scene from Mary Poppins in the bank, but across the whole country. The UK government bought a majority stake in RBS and provided capital to several other banks in exchange for shares. Thanks to the Treasury's intervention and the injection of liquidity, ordinary people were still able to access their pay, their pensions, their welfare payments. We didn't have a true apocalypse, which was on the horizon. Now, you may argue, as this young lady from Christ did earlier, all right, well, maybe New Labour did save us from an all-out banking collapse, but wasn't it their lax regulation and financial liberalisation which caused this in the first place? Well, no, I don't think so. There were over 30 times the number of regulators per number of financial employees in 2010 when New Labour left power as there were in the 1980s. Regulation by the state did not decrease, but it actually increased. Before the 1980s, financial services were regulated by very simple pieces of primary legislation, mainly around contract law, and private codes of conduct. The formation of the 1981 Companies Act and subsequent reforms shifted responsibility away from the financial sector and onto the state. And this sounds in theory like a good idea. We want financial institutions to be accountable. But what it meant was the buck now stopped with the state and not with banks and financial institutions. It granted effectively unlimited powers to a statutory regulatory bureau or to a body that was ultimately accountable to politicians rather than to participants in the market. And as we know, the state was and arguably never will be able to keep up with the rapidly diversifying and increasingly complex nature of financial products. So, in an ironic twist, if you want to blame regulation or lack thereof for the financial crisis, blame the Tories for putting in the wrong kind of state regulation. I'd like to close by borrowing from that very British of comedic ensembles, Monty Python, and ask, what did New Labour ever do for us? Well, it gave us a decade of sustained economic growth, the highest of any of the G6 economies. Sure.
You seem to be saying that the global financial crisis isn't Labour's fault, it's a global issue. But when it comes to economic growth, you're saying, even though it was global, you're saying, oh no, that's all New Labour's responsibility. When in reality, most of that economic growth evaporates during the financial crisis. So how can you square those 2 points? Global financial crisis is a global thing. Global economic growth is entirely down to.
So I think the difference is that. No, I think that's a very important point. But the point is that the UK's economic growth wasn't matching other world powers. It was ahead of it. And so we're not talking about a completely universal period of economic growth that was consistent across all world economies. Whereas with the financial crisis, we are talking about something that sort of did affect the whole economy. And I wasn't trying to say that, it's not New Labour's fault entirely because it's a global crisis, but because there were regulations that were put in place before New Labour came into power, and okay, we probably should have addressed that. But lots of these financial liberalisation policies were in place across the world. America, the rest of Europe, this wasn't a uniquely New Labour problem. And part of the reason why we ended up having this crisis was because of fractional reserve banking, which is something that is, part and parcel of every single banking. Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that not only did New Labour bail out Britain, that in the 2009 London conference scored ground coordination package of aid and deficit spending that reinflated the global economy, prevented another Great Depression, made the world economy rebound much quicker. And in that sense, could you not say that Gordon Brown and New Labour didn't just save Britain, they saved the entire world?
Well, here. Thank you very much for that. I was focusing on the motion and focusing on Britain, but actually you're right, they did save the whole world. So apart from over a decade of sustained economic growth, we also had, as Katie rightly said earlier, the introduction of a statutory minimum wage. The Working Time Regulations Act mandated 28 days of paid leave and break after every 6 hours of work for the first time. The Human Rights Act brought basic freedoms like the right to life, education, marriage, and freedom of expression into British law. As we've also touched upon, the Civil Partnership Act enabled same-sex couples to legally register their relationships for the first time in history. It brought us Sure Start as well, as Katie mentioned, the education maintenance allowance to help children from families on low incomes to continue their education post-16. And if we're talking about education, their city's academy movement dramatically improved academic attainment in some of the UK's most deprived inner-city areas. It gave greater means of self-determination to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And we can all debate over whether devolution was a good idea or not, but I do believe in the right to self-determination. The Good Friday Agreement, which is something we haven't really touched upon, brought peace to Northern Ireland after decades of conflict. Investment in the NHS under New Labour brought tens of thousands of more doctors, tens of thousands of more nurses, 100 new hospitals, 650 one-stop primary care centres, 90 new NHS walk-in centres, and over 99% of suspected cancer patients were seen by a specialist in 2 weeks. Waiting lists in 2009 were down by over 500,000, as Katie said, from where they were when New Labour came into power. The socialists among you might believe that New Labour should have done more, and I do not disagree. But now, after 12 years of Tory austerity, deliberate underinvestment and national neglect of the most vulnerable, those statistics are things we could only dream of. New Labour may not have saved Britain entirely, but without it, Britain would be in a far worse place than it is today. And on that note, I'll close my speech.